thank you for joining us today. We are delighted to be speaking to you all about a exciting and also quite a bit unknown topic in the interoperability space. I'm finding as I've been conversing with folks over the course of the last couple of days that not a lot of people are familiar with interoperability in TEFCA. So hopefully this will be a learning opportunity for some of you, and for those of you that know a lot about TEFCA and are waiting to sort of hear what is happening, hopefully it'll be informative to you all. I'm Annie Harrington. I am the Chief Legal Officer for Contexture, and I am sharing the stage with my colleague and friend Mel Soliz. Mel is a partner at Coppersmith Brockelman. She has been outside counsel for Health Current for a number of years and is truly one of the foremost experts in this space in the country. We are super lucky to have Mel as our outside counsel. What that means for those of you that are participants in the audience is that you can feel good knowing that that your HIE is guided by one of the best privacy lawyers in the country. So we are going to spend the next hour talking to you, as I said, about the Trusted Exchange Framework and Common Agreement. And we're going to dive right in. It wouldn't be a legal presentation without starting with a disclaimer. So I am going to just go ahead and let you know that just the standard disclaimer that these are our personal views, do not necessarily reflect the opinions of our employers, our respective employers. There is a lot changing in this space, so what we say today, frankly, could be outdated next week with how fast things are moving. This is also not legal advice, so if you have questions about how TEFCA will affect your organization or what you need to do to participate in TEFCA, we really advise you to seek legal counsel. And of course, we are always, both of us, open for questions and any conversation that you'd like to have following this panel. Oh, I need to go do my own slides. Forgetting this, sorry. That was the disclaimer that I was talking about just now. So what are we going to cover today? Mel is going to take us through a high-level overview of TEFCA. Frankly, there's far too much to cover in the course about this complex regulatory framework in the course of an hour. So we're going to hit the highlights, and we are particularly going to focus this on what TEFCA could mean for many of you all in the participant community in the provider and health plan space. A lot has been happening when vis-a-vis the QHIN, the Qualified Health Information Network, and somebody just raised their hand every time we use an acronym that you have no idea what we're saying, and we will try and do our best to stop and define it for you. We'll take you through who we think will be a QHIN, the QHIN designation process. And again, as I said, we're going to try to make this focused on the way that TEFCA stands to impact the healthcare provider and health plan community. We'll take you through some requirements of TEFCA. Suffice to say, there's a lot of contracts involved, so we'll try not to belabor that point other than to say that will be a huge part of participating in Contexture will be some of the legal requirements that accompany participating in the common agreement. And then I'll close us out to really share with you all what our thought process has been internally at Coreo and Contexture and Health Current over the past couple of years about TEFCA and as it's evolved, how our thinking has evolved and how we plan to participate in TEFCA, and we hope that you will participate with us. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Mel and hand over the slides.
I'm curious, I want to poll the audience. Raise your hand if you've heard of TEFCA. Okay, keep your hand up if you know what that acronym stands for. Oh yeah, I figured that might be the case. So TEFCA, a funny word, stands for Trusted Exchange Framework and Common Agreement. The entire purpose behind TEFCA is to establish a framework for nationwide interoperability. And when I say interoperability, I'm using it not only in a technical sense, but actually in a legal sense as well, and I'm borrowing it from the legal definition of interoperability. And it's the idea of being able to securely enable the exchange of electronic health information across different health technology systems without special effort on the part of the user. And this is actually a requirement of the 21st Century Cures Act. And when I say a requirement, I mean that the Office of the National Coordinator of Health Information Technology, or ONC, was required to establish this nationwide interoperability framework. So that's exactly what the ONC did. And TEFCA is primarily composed of 3 different documents. The first is the Trust Exchange Framework, so TEF, T-E-F, Trust Exchange Framework. The second is the Common Agreement, the CA component. And then there's also what's called the QHEN Technical Framework, or QTF, and it's something that you're obligated to comply with if you're a QHEN and you sign this thing called the Common Agreement. There are also standard operating procedures, SOAPs, or roadmaps, and metric reporting requirements. But we're really going to focus on the 3 core features of TEFCA and really what it means for the provider and payer community. So real quickly about Trusted Exchange Framework, or the TEF component. These are 7 non-binding trust principles. So the 7 non-binding trust principles are standardization, openness and transparency, cooperation and non-discrimination, privacy, security and safety, access, equity, and public health. These are ideas. They're informing what we have for the TEFCA framework and the other documents. The next one, which is super important, is the Common Agreement. These are our minimum baseline contractual requirements. I'm going to talk a lot about the Common Agreement today. And then, as I mentioned, the QN Technical Framework, or QTF. As you might suspect, these are minimum technical requirements. Neither Annie nor I are technical people, so you will not hear much about QTF requirements today. Also, I can and I do give workshops on each of these areas of TEFCA. The RCE also gives workshops about once a week on these components. So if there's one thing that you can take away from today's presentation, I want it to be big picture what TEFCA is and also what it isn't. So big picture, what TEFCA is, it is a contractual and operational framework for data sharing. That means it's the rules of the road. It's this idea of how we're going to securely do nationwide interoperability. It is not a network. It is not a technical standards body. It is not a technology. It's not a platform. It's not a data service. It's not even legally mandated. You don't have to do it. Okay? It is a data sharing framework, and how it's set up to work is you have something called the RCE that stands for the Recognized Coordinating Entity. That entity is the Sequoia Project. So ONC is tasked with go forth and create TEFCA. ONC engages the RCE, the Sequoia Project, to help us make TEFCA a reality. So the RCE does that and creates the Common Agreement and the QTF and the Trusted Exchange Framework. The idea is that the RCE is going to enter into the Common Agreement with these entities called Qualified Health Information Networks, or QHENs. The RCE is going to designate who gets to be a QHEN. What's a QHEN? A QHEN is that health information technology that is going to create the network that you're actually going to exchange data on and is going to exchange data with different QHENs. Now, the idea is that this QHEN is going to have customers. These customers are going to be called participants. These participants are going to sign service agreements with the QHEN. And then what the QHEN is going to do is flow down contractual requirements that are in its common agreement with the RCE. And then what's going to happen is those participants might have their own customers called sub-participants. They're also going to have to sign contracts. And guess what? Participants have to flow down certain requirements of the common agreement to these sub-participants. And it's this way that we create a common contractual framework for everybody is going to agree to these rules of the road for data sharing. So this might sound really familiar to you. In a lot of ways, TEFCA is just another iteration of what's come before it. It's the next stage, if you will. And I want to give you a little bit of history. I promise it won't be a long history lesson, and it'll provide some context for you that will help TEFCA make sense. So TEFCA actually predates the Cures Act by about a decade. It really started in 2006 when the ONC created the Nationwide Health Information Network. Okay, so 2006 is really the start of this. In 2012, ONC essentially privatizes this Nationwide Health Information Network by transitioning it over to the nonprofit Healthy Way. Guess what it becomes? eHealth Exchange. Have you all heard of eHealth Exchange? Raise your hand if you've heard of eHealth Exchange and the DIRSA. Yep. The eHealth Exchange shares data under the DIRSA framework. The DIRSA is its own rules of the road for data sharing. So Healthy Way in 2015 is renamed the Sequoia Project. The Sequoia Project is the one who really heralded or brought us the DIRSA framework with eHealth Exchange, and they also brought us Care Equality and the Care Equality Interoperability framework. Care Equality actually started out as an initiative of Healthy Way, now Sequoia Project in 2014, okay? And then what ends up happening is in 2018, eHealth Exchange and Care Equality, they become their own independent organizations. So they have their own governing bodies, and they're operating their own actual networks under different data sharing frameworks, eHealth Exchange under the DIRSA, Care Equality under the Care Equality Interoperability framework, but they're still subsidiaries of the Sequoia Project. Indeed, the folks who brought us the DIRSA and Care Equality also brought us TEFCA. These are the same technical people and the same legal people working on these contractual and technical documents. And there's a lot of similarities. You might have heard that Care Equality is called a network of networks. I'm just curious in the audience, is everybody familiar with Care Equality? Can you raise your hand if you've heard of Care Equality? If you're with a healthcare provider system, you probably heard about them because guess who participates in Care Equality? A lot of the EHR vendors like Epic and Cerner, they all participate in Care Equality. So for their framework, there's something called the Care Equality Interoperability Framework. In TEFCA, we call it the Common Agreement. In Care Equality, we have what are called Care Equality Implementers. In TEFCA, we have something called QHENs. In the Care Equality Framework, we have something called Care Equality Connections. These are the folks who share data pursuant to their customer contracts with the Care Equality Implementer. In TEFCA, we have something called participants and sub-participants who connect and share data through their QHENs. So there's a lot of similarities here in terms of this is just another network of network, an iteration of what's come before in terms of existing data sharing frameworks. Other data sharing frameworks that are out there that you or your organization might participate in is Patient-Centered Data Home, or PCDH, which has its own framework, a collaboration agreement, and then there's also Commonwealth as well. So you might be asking yourself, okay, so if TEFCA is just another iteration of what we've already seen, how is it different? How is it materially different from what we already have? Well, it does differ in a couple really important ways. And this is important. It is government endorsed. And government endorsement can matter, and I think it's going to matter increasingly more over time. And we're already starting to see that because we have governmental bodies like CMS and ONC essentially incentivizing participation in a TEFCA framework. We saw that with the Promoting Interoperability program. The IPS final rule, and I fully suspect that the MIPS final rule will look like this too. Instead of attesting to the 3 existing HIE objective measures, you can attest to the TEFCA measure and get the same incentives there for HIE participation. We are also, or at least I'm on pins and needles, waiting for the release of proposed rule changes to the ONC certification requirements and information blocking rule, and we're anticipated to see in some of these rule change a process for networks to attest to TEFCA adoption. So I'm pointing those out as examples of how government endorsement can show itself not only with a great big stick, and remember there is no great big stick here. TEFCA participation is not mandatory, but they might also have carrots for TEFCA participation. It's also really important to keep in mind that, there's a question in the audience. IPS, the Inpatient Prospective Payment System. You know, it's funny, I usually have that written down in my notes, and I deleted them from my notes today because nobody ever asked me that, so I figured I wouldn't have to remember it. But I think I got it right.
No, absolutely. Yep.
So some of the other important differences are it is really much more rigorous in terms of technical and governance requirements for that layer of QHENs that's going to bring us this network that we're going to use to share the data. And I'm going to share a little bit later in this presentation how rigorous that is. But it is fair to say it is much more rigorous than becoming a carry quality implementer. The other thing that's really important, I think, particularly for providers and payers to know, that if you decide to participate in a TEFCA data sharing framework, guess what? There is mandatory bi-directional data exchange, and it's for permitted purposes other than just treatment. Now, if you already participate in carry quality in the DRSA through eHealth Exchange, you're probably familiar with mandatory bilateral data sharing requirements where you have to respond back to treatment requests, but that's the only use case you have to participate in. Under TEFCA, there will be more use cases where you have to respond with data. Right off the bat, it's going to be treatment and also individual access services. So individual access services, what's that? That means I'm a patient, I download Apple Health participates in one of these networks, I request all of my records through a TEFCA connection through Apple Health. That's a good example of an individual access service. So there's a special focus on individual access services in the Common Agreement, and if you have questions about that, happy to talk to you about it offline, but there's a lot to unpack there. The other important difference is mandatory push capability. So what's that? Right now, the way a lot of networks work is I'm a provider, I'm seeing Mel Soliz. Mel Soliz is coming into my office, I query her on the network that I participate in, I get data back. Push is you're going to push out information about Melissa Soliz after she's seen. This is super important if you're with a provider who's subject to CMS e-notification requirements where at admission, discharge, and transfer, you have to push out data for your patients to their primary care physicians or to the post-acute care facility. Having the network be able to support push capability is going to be something that moves the needle for those types of organizations. So how does TEFCA fit into this existing marketplace now that you know what the marketplace is, what TEFCA is and isn't, where does it slot in? I can't underemphasize this. TEFCA does not replace any existing health information exchanges or networks or solutions that you're using. It is another option. It's another option for how you're going to share data with maybe an increased set of people, maybe the same set of people, maybe less people. We don't know yet because we don't have a live TEFCA network. And in deciding whether or not you're going to participate in TEFCA, go in with your eyes wide open. Have realistic expectations. TEFCA is not a silver bullet, even though there's a lot of miscommunication right now, I think, in the healthcare community about what TEFCA can and cannot solve for. It is not going to solve these really tough and tricky compliance situations with sensitive data laws. That is health information laws at the state or federal level that are more restrictive than HIPAA. TEFCA is really written to a HIPAA standard. It's not written to specifically comply with other state and federal laws, but those laws don't go away. The way TEFCA is set up is everybody in this data sharing system, this framework, has to comply with the laws that apply to them. Well, we're already going to do that. What TEFCA does not do is it does not bring to the table compliance solutions. It does not bring to the table technical solutions. There is not a TEFCA master patient index. In fact, QNs aren't even required to have a patient MPI. They can use a federated model where they push that down to their participants or their sub-participants. There's no identity verification solution. There's no data deduping solution. There's not even a bulk data transfer protocol here. It's all one-to-one patient. The other thing to keep in mind is we don't really know what audit and enforcement is going to look like for this trust exchange framework, okay? So the RCE only has contractual privity with these QHENs. We won't know what audit and enforcement looks like until we actually have live QHENs that have contractual provisions that tell us how they're going to make sure the people participating in their networks are doing things like applying with the laws that apply to them. TEFCA also doesn't solve data governance within these different QHEN networks. What does that look like for the communities that they serve? It also doesn't solve whether or not the data you get through a TEFCA network is actually useful or usable to you. That's something that is going to continue to be provided by your existing service vendors. So you might want to be asking yourself, well, who is going to be a QHEN? Well, I'm looking into the crystal ball. It's a false question. I don't know who's going to be a QHEN, but I can tell you who's publicly said, I want to be a QHEN, And these are organizations like Epic, eHealth Exchange, Commonwealth, Health Gorilla, Next Gen Healthcare, No2, there might be more, I didn't check this morning. These are the folks who publicly said, I want to be a QHEN, but I'll share with you, at least as of last week, the RCE has actually only received 4 formal intent to apply letters. So even though there's folks in the marketplace saying, oh, that's going to be me, that might not actually be them, and they might not actually end up applying. I want to give you some sense now about how rigorous the application process is and why you might have organizations saying, I'm going to be a QHEN, or I think I'm going to apply. They take a closer look and then they say, oh geez, maybe not. And the reason for it is incredibly rigorous. There is a whole SOP that's multiple pages long. Actually, there's multiple SOPs that are multiple pages long that tell you what you have to meet in order to be a QHEN. Now, we've broken them down on this slide into 4 criteria. The one, and this should make everybody in the room feel more secure in how this network is going to be set up, is that these QHEN entities do have to be US entities, and they can't be owned or controlled by a non-US person or entity, which is really important given the politics on today's global stage. The second criteria is they do have to be able to show that they can exchange required information for all the exchange purposes. And required information, guess what that means? That means all the PHI that they could have access to, and it's not limited to just what's in the designated record set. Wow, that's huge. That's a lot of data. They also have to be able to exchange it for all exchange purposes, not just treatment, not just individual access services, but payment, healthcare operations, there's public health use cases, there's government benefit use cases. They have to be able to support the exchange for all of those use cases. That might not be something that even today's carry quality implementers can meet. The third criteria is the ability to perform all the required functions under the Common Agreement, the SOPs, the QTFs, and being able to support a massive amount of transactions. They have to be able to support up to 50 million transactions a day. And during the onboarding process, they have to show that they have an existing history of over 1 million transactions, basically, I think on a monthly basis, for at least 12 months. So these aren't just attestations. This isn't just saying, yes, I can do this, or yes, I have done this. This is saying, I can document that I can do this. And there is significant organizational infrastructure and governance requirements here. They have to come at the time of application. So when they submit their app, 2 years of audited financial statements. You know, not all organizations have audited financial statements in this space. So that's going to significantly narrow down who can even apply to be a QHEN, but it is rigorous in the sense that these people have to have the financial resources to support these networks. So what is this whole process going to look like? I'm showing you this to give you some sense of timing, because you might be asking yourself, wait, there's TEFCA, it's part of IPS and MIPS, but we don't have any QHENs yet? Yes, that's true. We don't have any QHENs yet. The application will not go live in terms of people being able to apply to become one of these QHENs until October 3rd, okay? So on October 3rd, this application process can begin. There is a whole set of pre-application activities that folks who want to apply have to go through that starts with that letter of intent to apply. The RCE also has a whole communications protocol, because what's happening is folks who say, I want to be a QHEN, might not be giving accurate statements about what it means to be a QHEN or what TEFCA is. On a call just this week, the RCE made very clear that TEFCA is not a silver bullet. You can't, as an applicant to become a QHEN, go out and tell potential customers, drop all your other networks or your data exchange services, because I have TEFCA, I'm going to be a QHEN. Just come to me and I'll solve all your problems. The RCE is now directing in its communication protocols on how it applies it, that those type of statements cannot be made, because guess what? They're not accurate statements. So once you go through the pre-application activities, what happens is the QHEN who says, or the applicant who says, I want to be a QHEN, they're going to sign this 64-page contract that is the Common Agreement. The RCE is going to say, thank you very much. They're going to assess the application for up to 30 days. After that, if they get an eligibility determination, they can proceed with onboarding which has a whole series of rigorous production testing and then other requirements. If they make it through that, what the RCE will do is they'll say, yes, you get to be a QHEN, or maybe there's some gaps. They could get provisional QHEN status, and the RCE will say either you're a QHEN or a provisional QHEN. They'll countersign. And then what the RCE is going to do is, because we need a critical mass of QHENs to go live with a network, they're going to hold approval of the QHENs until they have this critical mass. Then they're going to release them all at once. The RCE doesn't know how long this whole initial process is going to take, but they're estimating, it could possibly be as short as 3 months, highly unlikely. It's much more likely to be between 12 and 15 months. So it'll likely not be until sometime in 2023 that we actually have a live network. So if you're here today with a provider or plan and you're wondering about how am I going to connect, how am I going to participate in TEFCA, well, the good news for you is once this does go live, which again, it won't be until later, 2023, I think there's a hand in the back. Did you have a question?
In your opinion, what number of students would constitute a critical mass?
I don't know, and I've asked the RCE. Lots of people have asked the RCE. They won't tell us for sure exactly what they're thinking. I think it's between 3 and 4, but I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised if it was between 3 and 4, and the reason why I think that is because under the common agreement, there's a whole governance structure for operations of TEFCA, and they have to have so many QHENs represented in that governance body in order to make decisions. So that's why I think that'll end up being the number. Sure.
Yeah, so Tim's question was, it's a resource-intensive process, just for the benefit of those who may be watching remotely. It's a resource-intensive process. Is there a chance that they could relax some of these requirements if they don't get a critical mass of participants? Also unknown.
And it's possible. I think they're already getting some pushbacks on things, excuse me, and things like the 2-year audited financial statements. But I don't know if they're going to back down from those requirements, because really, in order for this to work, there needs to be a high level of trust. And to have a high level of trust, you need really rigorous requirements. So I think that's what's driving it. In terms of where providers and payers can come in, you're going to have a lot of choices, whether you connect directly with a QHEN, whether you do it through a participant like a HIE or through an EMR. One of the things you need to think about in terms of whether or not you participate in TEFCA is, remember, TEFCA participation itself is not mandatory, but once you sign on that dotted line to participate in TEFCA exchange, guess what? Some things do become mandatory. You will have to engage in bilateral data exchange for mandatory permitted uses, and it's not just treatment, it's IAS, and it's also going to be other use cases like payment and healthcare operations eventually. Eventually, everything will be mandatory unless you're prohibited by applicable law from responding. It's a really important unless. Talk to your attorney about what that means for your organization. There's also a lot of flow down requirements. Don't have time to talk all about them today. If you want to go onto my law firm's website, we do things called Coppersmith Brockelman briefs. They're free. I have a very lengthy one on TEFCA requirements, and I kind of outline all the different flow down requirements that participants will have to agree to. And it's not just about the mandatory flow down requirements you're going to have to agree to. Each of these QHENs, so these organizations that are going to provide us this network, TEFCA gives us the minimum floor requirements. They are going to layer on top of that. Each QHEN will have a different offering. I don't know what that offering is going to look like because we don't have any QHENs. So you're going to need to carefully consider what's the right QHEN for my organization. And it might not just be the QHEN. It might be if you're coming in under a participant like an HIE or an EMR, is this the right participant for me? There's going to be different costs. Not everybody's going to charge the same thing. Remember all the stuff that TEFCA doesn't solve for? In order for a TEFCA connection to be useful to you, there better be solutions to solve for those technical and compliance issues. So be wary of at what level and who you choose to connect to so that you can make sure that you meet the needs of your organizations. So there's a lot of legal and business considerations here. I've talked way too much. I'm going to hand it over to Annie to talk about where Contexture fits into this.
Thanks, Mel, for that great overview. I think that one of the key takeaways that that certainly my team has commented on many times is that TEFCA is very good job security for lawyers, and you would not be wrong if that were your main takeaway from this, from that high-level overview from Mel. It is very complex, and it is as yet just a notion. It is an idea, a framework, not yet a network through which data is moving. That being the case, we understand that given how much effort is being put and spent at the federal level, it is incumbent upon us as the Health Information Organization for Arizona and Colorado to be thinking about how TEFCA will impact our services, our participants, our constituents, and stakeholders. So I'm going to spend the next little bit speaking about what our thoughts are on this subject and how we are planning to interact with the TEFCA network. I want to first stop and ask the audience, are any of you with organizations that have opted to be a QHIN or to try to be a QHIN through the application process that Mel just described? Okay, interesting, so no hands up. Have any of you yet, are any of you with organizations who are actively speaking about how TEFCA will impact data exchange through your organizations? Besides you, Morgan? Okay, so some of you are having these conversations, but it sounds like it's still early for others of you. That is good context for us. So we have been spending quite a lot of time thinking about how this will impact us, and so I'll endeavor for the next couple of minutes before we stop and do a Q&A to answer the following questions. First is just the threshold one: will we participate in TEFCA? How will we participate in TEFCA at Contexture? When will we have active TEFCA data exchange at Contexture? And how and what can our participants expect in a TEFCA connection that's offered through Contexture? I want to at the outset say there are so many unknowns that this may change, but this represents our best thinking at this moment, and some decisions are still being made on a daily basis based on the information that is coming out of the RCE and what will be coming out as the QHINs are designated. So first, the threshold question for you all. Oh, I got to change my slides. Will Contexture participate in a TEFCA data exchange? The short answer is yes, we will, and here's why. The mission of our organization is to support communities in our regions by facilitating secure information sharing in alignment with our community's values and input. TEFCA's goals are very aligned with that mission, right? TEFCA is intended to be a federally endorsed program that takes that data sharing that is already happening for communities in Arizona and Colorado and brings it to a national stage. There are a lot of unknowns about how the network itself will operate once it gets off the ground, but broadly speaking, the purpose of TEFCA is mission aligned with the purpose of Contexture, and our organization is always striving to ensure that data gets where it needs to go, when it needs to go. So a TEFCA connection would, depending on what it looks like, facilitate and further our own organizational goals. So we already offer access, as many of you know, that your data, if you are a participant in Contexture currently, your data may be flowing through the eHealth Exchange. So we already are participating in some of these broad national networks. PCDH is the Patient-Centered Data Home Network, which is another national organization that our data flows through. So TEFCA would be another national network that data could flow through in accordance with the terms and conditions that are applicable. So with that said, how will we participate in Contexture? We are Contexture. How will we participate in TEFCA? For starters, I think it's important for you all to know that we considered, especially early on when TEFCA was just even more of a notion and idea than it is now, we considered whether we were in a position to be a QHIN. Now that there is so much additional information about the expectations and requirements of a QHIN and what kinds of information exchange will have to be supported in order to be a QHIN, And now that there is broad understanding, having been mandated by the RCE, that no QHINs can charge data exchange for each other, we at Contexture have made a business decision that we will not be applying in this round of QHIN applications to serve in that capacity. It simply is too much of a commitment, too much of a financial burden to ask our participants to have to bear on behalf of national data exchange. So with that decision off the table, we have been considering very deeply and seriously how we will participate in Contexture. And I think the most likely path forward, and I'm looking at our EVP and our CEO sitting right in front of me, the most likely path forward is that Contexture will participate in TEFCA as a TEFCA participant itself. And I apologize for the double terminology. The term of art in TEFCA for somebody that participates in a QHIN is a participant, much like many of you are a participant in our current network. So the terminology is just as confusing as possible, which is super helpful. We will be closely watching the QHIN designation process. We expect a number of QHINs that Mel has already shared. So she shared that a number of entities have publicly stated that they intend to apply to be a QHIN. We are closely watching that. I will add that we have many organizations, health information exchange organizations across the country with whom we work closely. One of whom is CRISP, that supports HIE services in Maryland, Connecticut, West Virginia, Washington, D.C., and they have already publicly stated that they intend to participate in the eHealth Exchange QHIN if and when it is designated. We will closely watch the eHealth Exchange QHIN designation process since we already participate in the eHealth Exchange. That may be a likely on-ramp for us, but again, no firm decisions have been made yet, but that does represent our thought process about how we may interact with a QHIN when they become designated. I turned myself off. Did I? There we go. What will our TEFCA participation look like? Again, and I hate to caveat all of these, but again, per Mel's previous entire presentation, a lot is unknown, and so this represents my best guess at what our participation may look like and what you all in the audience that are current participants in Contexture could expect. We will likely offer a new service line, a new service offering. So much as you all currently can sign up for ADT services, portal services, data reporting services, and the sort that are already offered through the HIE, Contexture will likely offer a new service, which is to say we will offer a place and a way for you to connect and interact with the TEFCA network when it is actually operational. What will that look like? It will probably be an opt-in model. So it would not all participants will select Contexture as their on-ramp to the TEFCA network, but if you do, it will be a value add that we provide, and it will be likely in the form of an addendum to your current participation agreement with us. You would then, in that role, serve if I go back to this slide, in this picture, you'd see Contexture as the participant. This is a big table, and you all would be serving as sub-participants or interacting with the TEFCA network through our connection with a QHIN in the capacity of a sub-participant. Mel already previewed those mandatory flowdowns. I just want to flag for all of you, maybe some of you in the room are general counsel or lawyers, there will be a high legal component of this in the form of mandatory flowdowns that looks like we're anticipating approximately 46 flowdowns that will be required to flow from the QHIN to a participant down to sub-participants that would be embedded into any sort of contractual addendum that we ask you all to sign. At this point, it's hard to guess timeline. As Mel said, it could be as early as 3 months that we have a QHIN designation, so by the end of this year, but none of us think that is even a remote possibility. When you look at all of the steps and when you look at the amount of information that the RCE has to review before a QHIN will be designated, it is unlikely that we will see any data exchange through a TEFCA network for potentially 12 to 24 months. So this is still a ways out, and again, it will not be it will take a while for there to be a critical mass. Again, if organizations will opt in one by one, it will take a while before there is meaningful data exchange through any sort of TEFCA network. Why should you, so can I also get a show of hands just so I can gauge the audience participation here? How many of you are participants currently in the Contexture HIE? Okay, great, so a handful. How many of you represent providers or hospital systems? Okay, a couple. And how about health plans or payers? Okay, so we have a good mix. So I want to spend just the last slide talking about why you should consider accessing TEFCA, the TEFCA network, when it is stood up through Contexture. There's a number of reasons, and I'm going to highlight a few of them here. All of them are on this slide. First is affordability. Many of the TEFCA connections, the QHINs that will be eventually designated, the large EHRs, EMRs, there will be a potentially very high cost component of participating in the TEFCA network as an add-on service through an EMR. It certainly will be an expense. The type and load of data volume that they're expecting to be exchanged will be high, and so those costs will be borne most likely by the participants themselves. As a nonprofit organization, we will endeavor to provide our services at the very lowest cost that we can, and obviously we don't have any sort of profit motivations, and so that is, I think, a very significant advantage to you all when it comes to costs of interacting with the TEFCA network. The local governance structure I want to emphasize. As Mel said, TEFCA is not a silver bullet. There are many, many complex state and local regulations that will continue to have to be complied with regardless of your connection to the TEFCA network. You, as those of you who are already participants in Contexture either in Colorado or obviously here in Arizona, know that part of what we do is become experts on how to exchange data compliantly with the Part 2 regulations and with the many, many state requirements in Arizona, including the HIO law. QHINs that are national organizations will not have that same level of expertise, and so one of the advantages is the local governance structure that participating through an HIE like ours will offer. Compliance with the Arizona HIO statute, I just mentioned it, but it's worth calling out. Not many states have HIO statutes like Arizona, and we have, by virtue of our role as the HIO designated in the state, are experts in what it means and what is required to maintain compliant data exchange with the HIO statute. And so participating in a TEFCA data exchange at Contexture will certainly bring the assurances that we are doing so in compliance with state law here in Arizona. A focus on equity. I think one of the greatest challenges with TEFCA uptake will be many hospital systems will have the advantage of being able to connect through their EMR vendor if that's offered. But where does that leave the many providers, the rural facilities, the critical access hospitals who are already struggling with costs of interoperability and data exchange? If there are not lower cost, affordable options, they will be left behind. And so I think part of the role of the HIE and part of why participating in your local HIE matters is because we are spending the time to ensure that those last mile resources, those last mile connections are flowing through our organization, and that will be the same. We will bring the same opportunities in participating in the TEFCA network. We are at Contexture, patient matching, identity management is already part of what we do. And so those, even though we don't know exactly what the requirements will be for QHINs, those will continue to be strengths of Contexture in any sort of TEFCA data exchange. We handle granular consent already in Arizona, are one of the first HIEs in the country, and I've done lots of learning from Mel and from Melissa and all of my Arizona colleagues on the way that we already handle Part 2 data exchange here in Arizona. That will be an advantage in the TEFCA concept because we are further along than many other states and entities when it comes to how to manage consent of sensitive information through the HIE or through a networked environment. And finally, we're already offering access to other national networks, and TEFCA will be another added value service that we will provide. So, in closing, I want to emphasize what Mel started with. TEFCA is really not intended to be a substitute for participation in the HIE. TEFCA is a value-added service. It is a way to make sure that the information flowing through your local HIEs also has a national audience if that is if the information needs to travel outside of the confines of the regional areas that we serve. It will be another way of getting and moving data where it needs to go to serve patients. It will not replace the other HIE services that you all receive from us, so it will not be a replacement for the Arizona Healthcare Data Registry that you heard, Health Directives Registry that you heard Carla speak about so beautifully with our speakers this morning. It will not be a replacement for the Community Cares Program, SDOH network, and for all the other data health analytics, HIE analytics and services that we provide. It will not replace those services. I think that is an important thing to keep in mind. With that, I'm going to close this out and pause here for questions from the audience. We have a mic set up in the kind of the middle, and I think we have a few minutes. Morgan,
Hi, Annie. Mel.
what you got?
So full disclosure, I've seen this presentation 4 times, and I'm going to ask the same question I ask every time. So if I'm an Epic hospital or a provider that has an EMR that has stated to be a QHIN, I have a decision that I need to make in terms of who am I going to use to connect to the TEFCA framework. And if I choose to go one way or the other, can I choose both? And if I'm participating in Contexture and I choose to use my EMR vendor as my QHIN connection, then what happens to the data that goes to both places?
Well, I'm happy to take that one. So right now, to answer the first question is, can I participate in multiple different organizations that have a TEFCA connection? And the answer to that is yes, you can participate in multiple organizations that have TEFCA connections, but you can only participate in one of those TEFCA connections. So if you're being offered a TEFCA connection from your HIE and then also from your EMR, and you choose to go with your EMR, you can only choose your EMR. You can't choose your EMR and your HIE. There's business reasons why you might not want to do that, but from a technical reason and a contractual reason, the way the RCE has designed the TEFCA framework is that there's something called an RCE directory. And that's actually the directory that they use to know who's participating in TEFCA so they can get the data to the right place. You can only be listed in the directory once. So that means you can only participate through one TEFCA connection. Now, the reason they did that is they're trying to solve kind of the thing that is motivating the second question there. What happens when you have the exact same data flowing through this connection from multiple different sources? That's the reason why the RCE made it so you could only have one entry in the RCE directory. It's trying to limit that problem of duplicate data. Is it perfect? No. Is it going to cause some problems? Yes. Is this something that the RCE knows about, and are they maybe potentially rethinking it? I think the answer there is probably yes, too, because they're getting feedback on, does it really make sense to only let people have the choice of one QHIN to connect with for a TEFCA connection? The other thing I want to say here is if you choose on day one to connect with your EMR vendor, but then it becomes, for instance, maybe cost prohibitive or you're not getting the service you wanted and you want to switch later to a connection through like your HIE, you can do it. You're not captured or you're not locked in. You can change your mind at any time. As for the deduping problem, that'll continue to be a problem. There's going to be duplicate data in the TEFCA connections, just like there's duplicate data elsewhere. Apologies. It's the allergies. There is no deduping service through TEFCA. It'll depend on who you're using as your service provider and whether they have deduping solutions that can help you solve that problem. Annie, do you have anything to add?
I would just add that for participants that opt to participate in the TEFCA network through Contexture, when Contexture is queried, receives a query through the QHIN, then we would only be returning PHI for the entity that opted in to have Contexture serve as their TEFCA connection. So that would in some ways solve for some of the duplication, though I think that there will be value added. There will be service providers that add the deduplication as part of their QHIN offerings.
Let me start by saying thank you for an outstanding presentation. Very thorough and most appreciated. A really good overview of the situation. Having said that, from the perspective of a health plan or provider, okay, I'm concerned that in one of the slides, it looked like it was possible that there will be responsibilities that are going to flow down to me as a health plan or to me as a provider. If I look at those requirements and decide that they're just too onerous for what I want to do, okay? And since this is not a legal requirement, can I simply opt out of the whole thing? And are there good reasons for me to not want to do that?
Yeah, I think the short answer is yes. Part of what makes TEFCA unique at least for those of us that are regulatory lawyers and are used to requirements being in the form of regulations, TEFCA is not a regulation. It is a government-endorsed program, and it was required by federal law, but participation is not federally mandated. So you will have the opportunity or the ability, so to speak, to simply not participate. You won't have to opt in or out of anything. You just won't be a TEFCA participant. I think that the way that our understanding of the way that the federal government will incentivize participation is through perks, is through carrots, as Mel was saying. So you will get credit or reimbursement opportunities or credit for participating in the MIPS or the IPS programs. That will be how they incentivize and overcome any reticence that organizations may have to deal with a whole bunch of additional contractual flow downs in order to comply. I think what I didn't touch on earlier, but I think is embedded in the question that you asked is, what happens if there are specific uses that are required by TEFCA, but that we as Contexture, for example, as a health information organization, can't support. So currently we don't support individual access services. We don't allow data from the HIE to be sucked into a patient app, as Mel used in her example earlier. Because we are not permitted by law to do that. Our business associate agreements do not permit us to interact with patients directly in that way. So there will be some limitations that are required by law that will limit how certain organizations interact in a TEFCA network, and that may mean that you don't have to bidirectionally respond to every required mandatory use if you're not permitted to do so. But the details on that are still, I think, a ways out. Anything you'd add?
I do want to add here, because it's very interesting, I think, for health plans in particular, particularly because in a lot of networks, health plans aren't necessarily data contributors, even though there might be data requesters. And this is going to be a hard decision for a lot of plans because there are requirements like mandatory bilateral data exchange. You have to send data back, so you can't just take data. You do have to send data back. And I think for plans, it's very useful to think about these like your Medicaid or your Medicare or your marketplace flow downs. Like when you work with your vendors, you tell them, look, these are non-negotiable. If you want to do this service line, you have to agree to these flow downs. That is very much how these TEFCA flow downs are going to be. Some things like business terms are going to be negotiable, but of those, 40 plus flow downs in the common agreement, and the common agreement is a 60 plus page contractual document. There's a lot to flow down. A lot of those are going to be non-negotiable. So what that's going to mean is you're really going to be faced with, do I participate or do I not? Because you're going to have to accept those terms and conditions and then figure out a way to implement that if the answer is yes. So why might the answer be a yes for a health plan in particular? Well, health plans are subject to something called the CMS interoperability requirements, like patient access API, there's payer-to-payer exchange, and guess what? Big changes are coming. There's likely going to be a provider API requirement. There's also going to be prior auth API requirements. Now, when we first got the CMS interoperability rules, they talked about TEFCA, but they said, look, we're not going to look at TEFCA as a compliance option for meeting CMS interoperability mandates because we don't have TEFCA. Guess what? We have TEFCA now. So remember when I was talking about incentives? It is possible that this might be a potential incentive to get plans to participate in TEFCA connections later down the road through CMS interoperability mandates. We're not there yet. I'm guessing, but I could see that as something that would happen.
I think we've got time for one more.
Oh, good. That's me. Tony Dunnigan. I'm the CMIO at Valleywise Health. Great talk. I was at Epic Land a few weeks ago. We're on Epic. I went to some TEFCA stuff. This was way better. I understood this.
Good.
Thank you for breaking down the acronyms. It's helpful to know what it isn't, right? So I sign something in blood for care quality every year. I don't know what the hell it is. I assume it brings some data to us, and I think it does.
Yeah, that's terrifying. Don't tell your lawyer. Don't tell your lawyer.
Yeah.
Okay.
So don't tell him that. So I think Epic's play is fascinating to me, right? And so, the differentiator for me, to answer your question, can I get it in my EMR, right? Can I get it in my fancy 150 million whiz-bang EMR with clinical decision support, and so I can close care gaps and things like that. So and they're really talking this up, right? You guys have this equal value to me in my life. I mean, you've got all the statewide data, and maybe I can't get it in my EMR, but it's out there, and it can drive alerts and all the other services. So is this shaping up to be sort of synergistic? I think there's room for everybody, right? And I'm assuming these other things don't go away, like care quality and e-health exchange, and we're trying to connect to the Indian Hospital and the VA and all that. So if you could just kind of speak to that.
Yeah, so as we said earlier, TEFCA just slots into the existing market. The answer is no, the other networks aren't going away. How are they different? I tried my best to distinguish how they are. Is it possible that some networks might go away over time? Yeah, it's possible. I actually asked that question of the RCE earlier this week, is if the idea was that care equality, for instance, would eventually go away and be replaced by their TEFCA network. And they wouldn't give me an answer, but it's definitely a possibility. I'm sure it's something that they'll think about. A lot of this will come down to the uptake of TEFCA and whether TEFCA as an idea has legs, if it gets implemented, if it gets adopted, if people embrace the idea of mandatory data exchange for all of these use cases. So, we don't know how it's going to play out, and different organizations will assess this differently, and there is going to be different answers or conclusions reached by different types of organizations.
Thanks. I think it's a great question, and I wanted Mel to start because she asked that exact question of, as she said, the Sequoia project earlier this week, and they demurred, as they have to at this point. I think there will be really interesting free market implications here. I do think that we can expect multiple players to play a role, and I think that as a nonprofit health information organization who is dedicated to ensuring that all organizations across our state have some on-ramp to interoperability, that may be our niche. It may be that we end up being the TEFCA connection for the non-Epic shops, the non-Cerner shops. But that would be okay, because that would be absolutely in furtherance of our purpose and our goal, and would enable those, an on-ramp for everybody. I think that the last thing that I'll leave you with, and I don't mean to belabor the point, but part of what is happening in the market, and that we're particularly seeing from some of our big systems customers, is a misunderstanding or wrong understanding. I don't know exactly how to characterize it, that TEFCA is going to solve all of their interoperability issues and will be a replacement for HIE. And I think that if you leave this presentation with anything in your heads, we're a long, long way from that. We're not even close to we don't have a TEFCA network currently, and the amount of time and federal and state dollars that have been invested to ensure that we have a robust network in Arizona and Colorado to provide data where it needs to go to organizations can't be understated. So I think it's a great question, and time will tell. I think with that, we are out of time. It has been a pleasure speaking with you all today. Thank you for giving us the opportunity, and please know that Mel and I are available for any questions about TEFCA. It's a complex issue, and a lot is changing every day. So thank you again.